The owner of a bankrupt restaurant allowed a homeless woman and her daughter to live in the restaurant while it was being sold, and when he arrived a week later, Michael ran his hand through his gray hair, letting out a long sigh. The restaurant, once vibrant and welcoming, now seemed just a shadow of what it had been. The wooden tables, which had once been the stage for warm conversations and laughter, were now covered with a thin layer of dust. He paused for a moment, looking around, feeling the weight of the silence that dominated the space. It was almost palpable. The chairs, which had once scraped across the floor with the constant movement of customers, now stood still, as if waiting for something that would never come. As he walked through the empty dining area, Michael couldn't help but recall the early days of the restaurant. He had opened the place with so much enthusiasm, believing it would be the legacy he'd leave for his children. The aroma of homemade dishes, the soft music playing in the background, the unmistakable sound of pots and pans. Now all of that seemed distant, almost like a dream he wasn't sure if he had lived or imagined. He ran his hand over one of the tables, feeling the rough wood under his fingers, as if he were saying goodbye to an old friend. "It's strange," he murmured with a bitter smile on his lips, "to think that this place used to be full of laughter and hot meals." The words came out almost like a lament, echoing through the empty dining room. The sound of his own voice seemed out of place in that setting. Michael tried to imagine how things had come to this point. The economic crisis, the increasing competition, the accumulated fatigue. Each day was a battle until the wear became unbearable. He walked towards the kitchen, where he had so often led his team with passion and dedication. Now the space looked abandoned, the utensils resting in silence. Memories of long nights preparing special dishes for the most loyal customers flooded his mind. Michael could almost hear the sizzle of meat on the grill, the comforting sound of pan lids clinking. Nostalgia tightened his chest, and he shook his head as if trying to shake off the memories that haunted him. His eyes landed on the old shelf where the ingredients had once been carefully organized. It was almost empty now, with only a few forgotten cans, remnants of a time of plenty. There, in that space he had loved so much, the absence of life was painful. The restaurant had always been more than a business to him. It was a reflection of his soul, his hopes, and all the sacrifices made over the years. But now all that remained was a feeling of failure. Michael knew it was time to say goodbye. He had put the restaurant up for sale, hoping that someone might give it new life, but deep down he no longer believed that. Who would buy a place that was dying? And even if someone did buy it, he doubted they could bring back the shine it once had. Even so, something inside him still resisted the idea of giving up completely. Maybe it was just pride or a stubborn memory that refused to fade away. He walked to the front door, pausing for a moment before turning the key. The sound of the lock echoed in the silence, like a final punctuation mark in the restaurant's story. Michael felt a lump form in his throat but didn't allow the tears to come. There was no room for more sadness. The time for lamenting had passed. He opened the door and left, leaving behind what seemed like the end of a cycle he had never wanted to end. As he walked through the empty streets in the late afternoon, Michael wondered what he would do next. There was no more plan. The restaurant had been all he had known for years. Now, without it, it felt like an emptiness had settled within him. The city moved on, indifferent to his pain, and he, like so many others, would have to find a way to move on as well. But at that moment it seemed impossible. With one last look back, Michael contemplated the restaurant's facade. The dark windows reflected his tired face, but there was still something there, a small glimmer in his eyes that even he couldn't understand. The cold night wind made Michael pull his coat tighter around his body as he closed the restaurant door for the last time. He couldn't tear himself away from that building, even though he knew his time there had ended. His steps were heavy, echoing down the deserted sidewalk. Then, as he turned the corner, his eyes fell upon an unexpected scene. Under the pale light of a street lamp, a woman, weary but resolute, sat beside a small girl. Their simple, worn clothes suggested a hard life, but there was something about the way the woman held her head high that caught Michael's attention. The girl, no older than 6 or 7, was playing distractedly with a piece of paper, folding it into shapes only her imagination could understand. The silence between the two was almost tangible, but it didn't seem sad. It was as if they shared a deep understanding of life that, despite everything, kept them together. Michael hesitated, feeling as though he were intruding on something intimate by watching them. He began to look away when the woman stood up, as if she knew someone was there, watching in silence. "I'm sorry, sir." Her voice was low, but it carried an unexpected serenity. Her eyes met Michael's with a mixture of weariness and dignity. He was at a loss for words for a moment. Those simple words, coming from a woman who seemed to have endured so much, caught him by surprise. She didn't ask for food or money as he had seen so many times on the city's streets. Her request was only for a safe place for her and the girl to spend the night. Michael looked at the little girl, who now gazed at him with wide, curious eyes. She didn't say anything, just held her mother's hand tightly, as if that simple gesture was all she needed to feel safe. Something about the calm and restrained manner of the woman made him think that there was more to this story than he could see. The dignity in her gaze contrasted with the misery her appearance suggested. "We can stay anywhere, we don't need much. Just a roof, nothing more," Grace said, her voice serene, almost resigned, as if she were accustomed to fighting with her own words to keep her pride intact. Michael felt a pang in his chest upon hearing this. Her words were devoid of any emotional weight, but it was precisely that frankness that touched him. She wasn't there to beg for alms, and that was evident. Silence hung between them for a few seconds. Michael, unsure of what to say, looked back at the restaurant behind him. That empty building, which had once meant so much to him, now seemed like a simple solution to an immediate problem. He thought about how ironic the situation was. A place that no longer had a purpose for him but could, at least for one night, serve as shelter for a family that clearly had no other options. The little girl, Lily, continued to watch him with curiosity, as if expecting some magic word that would solve everything. Her large eyes were the picture of innocence mixed with a premature wisdom gained from a life of hardships. She squeezed her mother's hand, who didn't need to say anything more. The look between them was enough to understand the depth of the relationship they shared. Michael took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. He was faced with a choice. A decision that, however small it seemed, felt more significant than any he had made in recent months. Perhaps it was the silence between those three lost souls that moved him. Or perhaps it was the fact that, on that night, he felt that he could at least do something right, even amidst so many failures. Grace lowered her head as if she were already prepared for a refusal. But Michael, still wrestling with his own internal demons, simply nodded slightly. "Let's go inside," he said with a softer voice than he expected. He surprised himself with his own words, but in that moment, something in him knew he was making the right decision. She looked at him with gratitude, although her lips didn't need to pronounce anything. More than words, it was the glimmer in Grace's eyes that made him understand how much that simple gesture meant. As he unlocked the restaurant door once again, he felt that somehow that night would be a turning point, even if he couldn't yet comprehend why. Michael held the restaurant keys tightly as he watched Grace and Lily in front of him. Hesitation filled his thoughts. He wasn't the type of man who usually made impulsive decisions, especially with his life falling apart around him. That place, which had been his livelihood for so long, was now empty, waiting for a buyer who might never appear. "What more could I lose?" he murmured to himself, feeling the words as a bitter consolation. As he watched Grace carefully hold Lily's small hand, something inside Michael compelled him to act. It was an instinct he couldn't ignore. He, who had already lost so much, couldn't see how a gesture of kindness could make things worse. The harsh reality reminded him that he had nothing more to offer, but at the same time, the empty space before him seemed to cry out for some purpose, even if temporary. Perhaps it was fate showing him one last opportunity to do something right. "The restaurant is for sale," he said with a voice firmer than he felt inside. Grace looked at him with a mix of understanding and caution. "I don't know how long it will stay like this, but you can stay until then." His words came out without much emotion, as if the simple act of offering them relieved him of some burden. He felt exhausted, physically and emotionally, but there was a strange peace in allowing that place to shelter someone, even if only for a short time. Grace, always careful with her words, just nodded. "We are grateful, sir," she said, her voice almost a whisper but laden with sincerity. There were no exaggerations, no tears. Just the silent acceptance of someone who knows that any help, no matter how small, can make all the difference. Lily, in turn, looked at Michael with the same curious eyes as before, holding her mother's hand tightly. Entering the restaurant with those two seemed surreal to Michael. He had already lost his emotional connection to that space, but now, seeing Grace and Lily cross the door with a silent hope, something inside him seemed to awaken. The place was still empty, the tables covered in dust, but the simple sound of their footsteps on the wooden floor brought a life that he thought had been extinguished forever. As he guided them through the dining area, Michael noticed how Lily looked around, absorbing every detail of the restaurant. Perhaps she saw something that he no longer did, or maybe it was just a child's curiosity that allowed her to see beauty where adults only saw ruins. Grace, however, remained quiet, observing everything with a kind of reverence. Michael couldn't decipher her thoughts, but he could feel the implicit gratitude in her every movement. "I don't have much to offer," Michael began, not sure if he was speaking to Grace or to himself. "But there's water, a stove, and some space in the back where you can rest." His voice echoed through the empty dining room, mixed with the distant sound of the wind outside. Grace took a step forward and placed her hand on the counter, as if wanting to feel the history of that place. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Michael realized there was an invisible strength in the woman before him. Something he hadn't noticed before. "This is more than enough," Grace said with a light but honest smile. "We'll take good care of it." The simplicity of that promise brought an unexpected warmth to Michael's heart. He knew there wasn't much they could do, but Grace's words carried a meaning that went beyond the physical. It was a promise of respect, of care, something that, in a way, he had also missed. Taking care of something that seemed lost. Michael sighed, almost relieved for having made the decision. Perhaps, by offering shelter to Grace and Lily, he was trying to find some meaning in everything he had lost. He didn't know what the future held, but for that night at least, the restaurant would have a purpose. "I've already lost so much," he repeated in his mind. "Offering a little help, it won't cost me anything." And with that thought, he gave one last look at the place, feeling that maybe, for the first time in a long time, he had done something right. Michael closed the restaurant door with a soft click, feeling the cold metal of the doorknob against his skin. He looked at the place one last time, his heart heavy as if leaving behind a part of himself. The space that had once been his second home, where every detail carried a story, now felt like a lifeless body. It was hard to believe that the restaurant, which had once pulsed with so much life, was about to slip out of his control. The empty tables, the stacked chairs, everything reminded him of the failure he couldn't avoid. As he walked away, Michael felt the weight of the keys in his pocket, an uncomfortable reminder that he was still the owner, at least for now. He walked slowly, absorbing the silence that surrounded the place. The sound of his footsteps echoed on the nearly deserted street. The cold night wind blew, lifting small pieces of newspaper across the ground. He knew that by locking that door he was closing an important chapter in his life, but the sense of powerlessness in the face of it left him bitter. Before walking away completely, Michael stopped, looking again at the facade. The faded sign still bore the name he had chosen years ago. Every inch of that place had been designed with care, from the wooden counter to the lights hanging over the tables. He remembered the days when he ran from one side to the other, serving customers, organizing the kitchen, planning menus. It all seemed so distant now, like a dream slowly fading away. "So this is it?" he murmured to himself, his eyes fixed on the dark windows. The building, once lit up and full of life, was now engulfed in darkness. It was hard to accept that, soon, someone else would take his place there, someone who might never understand the significance of that restaurant. To them, it would just be a business, an opportunity for profit. To Michael, it had been the realization of a dream, a refuge from years of hard work and passion. He sighed, feeling a pressure in his chest. "Goodbye, old friend," he whispered, his voice choked with emotional exhaustion. "At least may you serve as shelter." And that was all he wished for now, that the restaurant, at least, could provide a bit of warmth to that small family in need. His mind drifted back to Grace and Lily, now sheltered within those walls he had built. Maybe it was better this way. Let them use the place for protection while he continued his own journey, not quite sure where it would lead. Michael began to walk away slowly, each step feeling like an enormous effort. Something inside him resisted leaving the restaurant, as if, in some way, he still hoped that things might change. But reality pulled him back, reminding him that he had done everything in his power. Failure wasn't something he could control. It was simply the natural course of a tide he couldn't hold back. The cold of the night enveloped him completely, and he pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, trying to shield himself from the biting wind. The streets were empty, as if the world had paused, waiting for something. Michael felt the same way, suspended in a limbo where everything was uncertain. Without the restaurant, he didn't know what his next step would be. The bills still needed to be paid, the days would keep passing, but where would he go now? As he walked, he felt the tears burning in his eyes. It wasn't just the restaurant he was leaving behind, but a part of himself. That feeling of failure, of loss, was overwhelming. Michael swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep moving forward. Perhaps there was some comfort in the thought that, even in the midst of his own storm, he had helped someone. As he turned the corner and disappeared from the restaurant's view, he didn't look back. He knew that if he did, he wouldn't have the strength to keep walking. And as difficult as it was, he knew he had to move forward, even though the future seemed like a frightening unknown. The restaurant was now part of his past, and despite everything, he was determined to find a new beginning, no matter how distant it seemed. Grace pushed the heavy glass door of the restaurant carefully, making sure Lily was right behind her. The girl, curious and attentive, looked around with wide eyes, absorbing every detail of the place that would now temporarily be their home. The smell of old wood and the echo of silence filled the space. The tables, covered with a thin layer of dust, seemed abandoned for a long time. Grace took a deep breath, feeling the dense air of that space. She knew that, as desolate as the restaurant was, it was more than they had had in recent weeks. It was a shelter. Instead of succumbing to the exhaustion of life on the streets, Grace looked around with determination. There was something special about this place, a hidden potential behind every corner. She couldn't ignore the opportunity that had fallen into her hands. The space might be empty, but there was still hope in the air. "If we're going to stay here," she said, breaking the silence with her soft voice, "we need to take care of this place." Lily looked at her, her eyes shining with a mix of exhaustion and admiration. Her mother always had a way of transforming things, even in the most difficult situations. Grace rolled up her sleeves as if preparing for a battle. And in a way she was. This was a fight for dignity, for survival. She began cleaning the tables one by one, feeling the worn texture of the wood under her fingers. Each of her movements was precise, almost ritualistic. It wasn't just a matter of hygiene. It was as if she were trying to bring life back to that space, rescuing it from the lethargy that time had imposed. Lily, always observant, began to help, wiping down the chairs around them. Her movements were slower, childish, but full of determination. As she organized the dining area, Grace felt a strange connection to that place. She didn't know what the future held, but there was something comforting about bringing order to chaos, even if it was just within the small world of the restaurant. She stacked the chairs carefully, straightened the tables, taking small steps that, little by little, made the space look less abandoned. It was as if, by taking care of that space, she was also taking care of herself and Lily. "Do you think the man will come back?" asked Lily, her sweet voice full of curiosity. Grace paused for a moment, considering the question. She didn't have an answer for that. Michael had seemed lost in his own thoughts when he left them there. The only certainty Grace had was that she couldn't depend on anyone but herself. "I don't know, dear," she replied with a gentle smile. "But while we're here, let's make the most of what we have." The light streaming through the dirty windows illuminated small patches of the dining room, creating a contrast between shadow and brightness. Slowly the place began to gain a new energy. Grace kept cleaning, moving with purpose. She headed to the small kitchen area, opening drawers and rummaging through cabinets. She found some forgotten utensils, covered in dust and neglect. She mentally took note of every discovery, as if she were already starting to plan something in her mind. With every step she took, Grace felt as if she were rescuing the restaurant from decay, bringing a little life back into the space. It wasn't just for her or Lily, but for something bigger. In that moment she saw an opportunity. As simple as it was, taking care of that place was a way of reclaiming the dignity that had so often been denied to her. It was a chance for a fresh start, even if temporary. "Look, Mommy," Lily exclaimed, pointing to a small flower growing between the cracks in the sidewalk outside. Grace smiled, noticing the detail. That small gesture of nature seemed to reflect their situation. Even amidst so much harshness and abandonment, something managed to bloom. Perhaps that place, like them, still had a chance to be reborn. It was an idea that, though distant, warmed Grace's heart. With the dining room tidied and cleaned, Grace approached Lily, running her hand lovingly through her daughter's hair. "It's looking nice, isn't it?" she asked, more to encourage herself than expecting a response. Lily nodded with a light smile, her eyes sparkling with hope. Grace knew that, for now, that was the most they could do. The first step had been taken, and with it, a seed of something greater was starting to form in her mind. Grace was in the small restaurant kitchen, her eyes scanning every corner as if she were discovering unknown territory. The place, still dusty and with old utensils piled up in the cabinets, seemed dormant. She opened one of the drawers, finding wooden spoons and dull knives, all marked by time. There was something melancholic, yet comforting, in the simplicity of it all. The pots, rusty and abandoned, seemed to ask for a second chance, and in that moment, Grace decided she would give them new life. With just a few ingredients available, some wilted vegetables, flour, eggs, and a can of beans, Grace began working with the pots as if reuniting with an old friend. Her hands moved naturally, driven by the instinct of someone who had, for many years, mastered the art of cooking in the midst of scarcity. Every knife cut, every mixture brought back memories she hadn't realized she still carried. "Who would have thought I still know how to turn so little into something special?" she murmured with a light smile as she stirred the dough for an improvised bread. Lily, sitting on a nearby stool, watched with curious eyes, not fully understanding what her mother was doing but admiring every movement. Grace handled the ingredients with a calmness that exuded confidence. There was something magical about seeing those simple foods transform into something more. "Have you done this before, Mommy?" asked Lily, curious as her small feet swung in the air. Grace smiled without taking her eyes off the pot. "A long time ago, yes, when I still believed this could change the world." The smell began to fill the kitchen. It was a familiar aroma yet powerful, something that filled the air with warmth and nostalgia. Grace had created simple dishes, but the scent rising from the pots was irresistible. She didn't have a precise recipe in mind, just followed her instincts, trusting the skills that had long been dormant. The steam rose, dancing through the kitchen as if celebrating the return of someone who once knew how to master fire. When Grace placed the first batch of improvised bread in the oven, she looked around and felt a wave of pride. For so long, she had forgotten what it was like to create something with her own hands, something that could not only nourish but also bring comfort. She turned to Lily, who watched her with a smile of admiration. "This is going to be good, isn't it, Mommy?" Grace nodded. "Yes, dear. It's going to be very good." As time passed, Grace continued to explore what the kitchen had to offer. The stove, which sizzled softly, seemed to come to life under her hands. She found some dried herbs at the back of a cabinet and decided to add a touch of freshness to the dishes. With creativity, she used what was at hand, turning what seemed like a challenge into an opportunity for rediscovery. The kitchen now pulsed with life. The warmth of the oven, the sound of the knife cutting vegetables, the sizzle of the frying pan, all of it seemed to give the restaurant a new breath, a second chance. Grace felt a sense of renewal wash over her. It wasn't just the food that was being reborn, but she too, a woman who, despite so many struggles, still knew how to find beauty in the simple act of cooking. "Who would have thought I still had this in me?" she thought as she tasted a spoonful of soup. The broth, though simple, was full of flavor. She couldn't offer luxury, but she could offer what she knew how to do best: dishes that comforted the soul. She felt lighter than she had in a long time, as if, in some way, that restaurant was starting to give back to her something life had taken away. Lily, feeling her stomach rumble, approached the counter and peeked at the dishes her mother was preparing. "Can I taste it, Mommy?" Grace laughed, wiping her hands on the makeshift apron. "Just a little, it's not ready yet." She offered her daughter a small spoonful, and Lily closed her eyes as she savored the hot broth. "It's the best ever!" exclaimed the girl. Grace's heart warmed. What had once been mere survival was now turning into something greater. And without realizing it, she was creating not just a meal but a new story to tell. The smell in the air was irresistible. The steam from the pots and pans in the restaurant's kitchen spread through the deserted streets of the city, filling every corner and inviting passers-by with promises of a long-forgotten taste. Grace had no idea that her simple act, cooking for herself and Lily, was catching the attention of those passing by the restaurant. She was so immersed in her work that she didn't even notice when the first curious people started to approach, intrigued by the aroma that danced in the cold night air. Outside, a man slowed down as he smelled the scent coming from the restaurant. He looked at the windows, which had seemed so silent and abandoned just a short while ago, and driven by hunger and curiosity, he approached the door. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if the place was really open. But the smell, that was undeniable, something homemade, something made with love and patience. He touched the doorknob, hearing the light sound of the bell hanging above the door as he opened it. Grace, who was facing away from the dining area, heard the bell tinkle but thought it was just the wind. It was only when the door closed again and the sound of footsteps echoed on the wooden floor that she turned around and saw the man standing, hesitant, in front of the empty tables. He seemed surprised to find someone inside, but even more surprised to find the delicious smell that had led him there. "Are you open?" he asked, a shy smile on his lips. "This smell is irresistible." For a second, Grace was speechless, not knowing how to react. The restaurant technically wasn't open. She was just cooking for herself and her daughter, never imagining that anyone from the outside might be interested. But the man's hungry and curious look made her hesitate. I was just making something simple," she began to say, still uncertain, but the man was already moving forward, sitting down at one of the tables as if he were a regular customer. "If it's that simple, I can't wait to taste it." Lily, watching the scene, smiled at her mother with a sparkle of anticipation in her eyes. Grace, with no other option, took a deep breath and served the man what she had prepared. She approached the table, the plate in her hands, and placed it in front of him. "It's not much, just something I had around." The man looked at the steaming bowl before him, inhaling the aroma more closely before picking up the spoon. As he took his first bite, his eyes widened in surprise. "This is incredible," he exclaimed, the flavor enveloping him like a warm hug. "I didn't expect something like this. It's wonderful." The sincere and enthusiastic words hit Grace in a way she hadn't expected. It had been so long since anyone had praised her cooking, and she had almost forgotten what that felt like. The man continued to eat slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a small revelation, something he hadn't known he was missing until he tasted it. Grace watched, still somewhat skeptical, but slowly the timid smile on her face began to grow. It was just one man, an unexpected customer, but his presence there, praising what she had made with so few resources, seemed like a sign. Perhaps this place, which she had thought to be just a temporary shelter, was ready for something more. Perhaps there was a chance to revive the restaurant and, along with it, something within herself. As the man finished his meal, the doorbell tinkled again. Another curious person entered, drawn by the same irresistible aroma. "Excuse me," the woman said, unsure. "Are you still serving? The smell outside is so good I had to come in." Grace exchanged a quick glance with Lily, who could no longer hide her excitement. "Yes," Grace responded with a calmness she didn't feel inside. "Please have a seat." She didn't know where the next dishes would come from, but at that moment that didn't matter. Something was happening and she couldn't deny herself this chance. The first customers left the restaurant with smiles on their faces, satisfied and surprised. Grace, still absorbing the idea of having served actual people, could hardly believe what had just happened. She looked at Lily, who was sitting at one of the tables, swinging her legs casually. "I think they liked it, Mommy," said the girl with a mischievous smile, as if she already knew that this was just the beginning. Grace laughed, a little nervous, still not realizing that word was already beginning to spread in the surrounding area. The next day, the aroma of Grace's dishes once again filled the nearby streets around the restaurant. The movement was slow at first. A few people passed by, curious but hesitated to enter. However, as the smell intensified, it seemed impossible to ignore. Soon, a couple entered, drawn by the same irresistible aroma that had enchanted the first customers. "We heard there's something special being served here," the man said with a tone of expectation. Grace, surprised at how quickly the news was spreading, nodded and led them to a table, still trying to process this new reality. Conversations among the locals began to gain momentum. "Have you heard about that old restaurant that's starting to reopen?" they asked each other in bakeries and street corners. "They say the food is simple but incredible. And the atmosphere? It feels so cozy." In no time, word of mouth worked its magic. What was once an empty and lifeless restaurant now began to transform into a meeting place for people seeking something different, something homemade, with soul. On the third day, Grace barely had time to breathe. The tables that had once been dusty and empty were now occupied by small groups, all drawn by what they had heard from friends or neighbors. She worked tirelessly in the kitchen, preparing dishes with the few ingredients she had, but each meal seemed to touch people in a special way. The warmth of human connection began to fill the space, and the loneliness that once dominated the restaurant disappeared with the soft sounds of conversations and the clinking of cutlery. Lily helped as best she could, running between tables, delivering glasses of water, or collecting empty plates with a shy smile. "People seem happy, Mommy," she said, looking around, amazed by the activity. Grace, with her face slightly sweaty and her hair tied up haphazardly, looked at her daughter with a tenderness that filled her with hope. "Yes, sweetheart. I think we're doing something right." Word of mouth continued to spread through the city like a controlled wildfire. "I don't know what's happening in that place, but they say it's the best home-cooked meal in town," said the most enthusiastic people. Those who had never set foot in the restaurant began to make plans to visit it. Grace overheard whispers of admiration as she passed through the tables, collecting empty plates and exchanging brief words with the customers, still incredulous at what she was witnessing. At night, when the restaurant finally closed, Grace and Lily sat at the last table, exhausted but satisfied. The dining room, which had once seemed like an echo of lost dreams, was now filled with a different energy, one that pulsed with life, as if the restaurant were being reborn from the ashes. "Did you see how many people came today?" Lily asked, her eyes shining with excitement. Grace smiled and nodded, unable to hide the pride she felt. Every dish served, every smile received was a silent victory, a proof that even when the world seemed to be falling apart, something new could emerge. As the days passed, Grace and Lily's routine became more intense, but also more rewarding. The restaurant, which had once been condemned to abandonment, began to transform into a symbol of resilience and hope. Grace felt the weight of each dish she prepared, not as a burden, but as a responsibility that, strangely, gave her strength. She didn't know what the future held, but at that moment, it was enough to know that the present was flourishing. Each customer who entered brought with them a story, a new face, a smile of approval. And as more people filled the space, Grace realized that, in some way, her own life was also being renewed. The restaurant was coming back to life, and along with it, Grace was rediscovering herself, one step at a time. Michael walked down the street toward the restaurant, his heart heavy with the idea of closing the final chapter of his life there. It had been a week since he left Grace and Lily in that empty space, and he had no great expectations about what he would find. Maybe the place was even dustier, maybe Grace had already moved on like so many others who come and go in life. He imagined an even more dilapidated restaurant, maybe with dirty windows and silence echoing in every corner, reflecting the ruin of a dream. When he turned the corner and the restaurant came into view, Michael stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, his eyes wide open. What he saw made no sense. The facade was alive, and through the windows, he could see the frantic movement of people coming and going. Customers. The muffled sound of voices and laughter echoed to where he stood. His feet felt glued to the ground, unable to move forward. What's going on here? He muttered to himself, incredulous. With a mix of curiosity and disbelief, Michael took the first steps toward the entrance. Each heartbeat echoed in his ears. As he got closer, he smelled the familiar aroma of homemade food in the air, but it was more than that. The smell was comforting, almost nostalgic, bringing back memories of better days when the restaurant still thrived. He stood still for a few seconds, inhaling that delicious scent, as if he needed another moment to believe it was real. Carefully pushing the door open, Michael was greeted by the warm sound of conversations and laughter. The tables he had left dusty and forgotten were now occupied by groups of customers, all enjoying dishes that looked simple but delicious. The soft evening light entered through the windows, illuminating the room with a welcoming atmosphere, something he hadn't seen since the restaurant's early years. Suddenly, the restaurant no longer seemed like a ruin. It looked alive. He scanned the dining area, trying to find any sign of Grace or Lily, but what shocked him most was the environment itself. The chairs were aligned, the tables clean, and even the small flowers he had planted at the beginning, but that had never bloomed, now seemed to be part of the decor, bringing a touch of color to that space that, a week ago, had been dead. Michael could hardly believe what he was seeing. How was this possible? How, in such a short time, had something so worn out transformed? Michael continued walking through the room, his hands brushing against the backs of the chairs, still stunned by what he was witnessing. People were smiling as they ate, exchanging stories and compliments about the food. "It's the best dish I've ever tasted," he heard someone say in the background. The shock hit him hard. Not only was the restaurant operating, but it was thriving in a way he hadn't imagined in years. As he moved further toward the center of the room, he saw something that made him stop again. Lily, Grace's little daughter, was there, sitting on the floor near the counter, playing with something improvised, her hair loose and laughing carefree. Around her, no one seemed to mind. The restaurant was now a place where children could play, and adults could relax as if they were at home. The space had become much more than he had dreamed, and all of it was unbelievable. He stood there, frozen, unable to take his eyes off what he saw. The feeling of disorientation began to give way to a kind of silent admiration. Something beyond his understanding was happening in that place. Michael felt the warmth of something forgotten heat up his chest. Hope. The same hope he had lost weeks ago when he thought the restaurant was doomed to fail. There, before his eyes, was proof that life had its own twists and turns. With hesitant steps, Michael walked a few more meters toward the kitchen, his heart now racing with the expectation of seeing Grace. He needed to understand what had happened, how everything had changed so drastically. But at the same time, a deep sense of gratitude was emerging. Maybe, just maybe, he was witnessing the rebirth of not just a restaurant, but something much bigger, something he didn't even know he was looking for. Michael, still stunned by the life he saw pulsing in the restaurant, made his way toward the kitchen, his heart racing. Every step felt heavier, not from fatigue, but from the mix of emotions now consuming him. When he pushed open the kitchen door, it was as if he had entered another world. The muffled sound of laughter, the steam rising from the pots, the smell of herbs and spices, everything there screamed that the place had been reborn. And in the center of all this activity, with a calm and determined presence, was Grace. She was directing the small improvised team, 2 people, maybe neighbors or volunteers, who followed her instructions with precision and respect. Her posture was confident, her eyes keen on every detail coming off the stove. The way she moved her arms, tasted a sauce, and adjusted the seasoning, showed an intimacy with the kitchen that Michael had never imagined. She didn't look like a woman adrift, but someone who had found, even by chance, the place where she truly belonged. For a moment he stood in silence, watching her. The shock of seeing her transform that space, which he had considered a ruin, was overwhelming. It was as if the restaurant had been reborn through Grace's hands, without him even realizing it. The sound of spoons clinking against pans, the smell filling the air, and the soft laughter of Lily playing in the dining area formed an unexpected melody. Michael was in the middle of a scene he had never foreseen. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice rough with surprise. "Grace, what have you done?" His question was loaded with disbelief, as if he still couldn't believe the transformation before his eyes was real. He had expected to find the restaurant in the same state of abandonment, but instead he found a place full of life, welcoming, almost magical. Grace looked up in his direction, a slight surprise in her eyes, but no panic. She smiled softly, wiping her hands on her apron as she walked over to him. "I just did what anyone would do," she began, her voice calm with no trace of arrogance. "I tried to take care of something that was given to us." There was a simplicity in the explanation, a humility that only made Michael feel a mixture of gratitude and admiration for this woman. Michael, still processing everything, looked around the kitchen again, now noticing the details he had previously overlooked. The organization, the improvised ingredients, the care with which each dish was treated. Everything there bore Grace's signature, her careful hand, and her almost obstinate dedication. He remembered how she had arrived, exhausted, asking only for a roof over her head for the night. Now she had not only transformed the restaurant but also something inside him. "I had no idea," Michael began, his voice faltering for a moment. "I thought everything was over, that there was nothing left to save." He shook his head as if trying to find the right words to describe what he was feeling. But how to explain the surprise and joy now welling up inside him, an emotion so new that it left him speechless. He could only look at Grace with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Grace gave a small, almost shy smile, but her eyes were full of determination. "When you left us here, Michael, you gave us an opportunity. It wasn't much, I know, but for us, it was everything." She looked around, gesturing to the space that suddenly seemed cozier than ever. "And I couldn't just waste that." The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but it was loaded with meaning. Michael knew that what Grace had done wasn't just for herself or for Lily. She had saved something he had long since given up fighting to keep. And in doing so, Grace had also restored something inside him that he thought was lost. The belief that sometimes when everything seems to be falling apart, a new chance may be just around the corner. Grace remained silent for a few moments as if searching for the right words, her eyes focused on the kitchen floor. Michael, still trying to process everything that had happened, watched her closely. There was something more about this woman, something he still didn't know, but he felt it was about to be revealed. When she finally looked up, her eyes carried a depth that Michael had never noticed before. "I've always loved cooking," Grace began, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Since I was little, I dreamed of having my own restaurant. It didn't have to be something grand, just a place where people felt at home, where food could comfort and bring joy like it did for me." She gave a small smile, remembering the afternoon she spent in the kitchen, helping her mother prepare simple but love-filled dishes. "For me, cooking was always more than just food. It was a way to care for others." Michael felt a tightness in his chest upon hearing that. He knew what it meant to dream, to dedicate years to something that seemed to give life meaning. However, he also knew the weight of watching that dream fall apart. "And what happened?" he asked, hesitantly but genuinely curious. He had seen the pain in Grace's eyes before, but he had never known what had brought her to that corner, with her daughter in her arms and an untold story. Grace took a deep breath as if the memories were still painful. "Life happened," she said with a resigned sigh. "I lost my husband when Lily was still small. He was everything to us. After that, things started to fall apart. Without him, the dreams I had seemed distant. Soon I lost the house, the job, and all that was left was the street." Her voice was calm, but there was a pain there, a bitter acceptance of what fate had dealt her. "But even when it seemed like everything was lost, I never gave up, you know?" Grace continued, her tone now more resolute. "Something inside me always believed that there would be a way to start over. I just didn't know how. Cooking was the only thing I had, the only skill I knew I couldn't lose no matter how hard things got." She looked at her hands as if she could see the marks of a life of struggles in them. "It was like an anchor. When everything else disappeared, I still had that." Michael felt the weight of Grace's words, and suddenly, the restaurant was no longer just a failed business he was trying to sell. He saw the reflection of his own feelings in it. The place, which for him represented years of hard work and a painful downfall, was for Grace a chance at rebirth, a way to transform what was left of her dream into something real. There was something deeply powerful in that moment, as if both of them were connected by a mutual understanding of what it meant to lose everything and still keep going. I knew that if I had an opportunity, no matter how small, I could start again. And then you appeared, she said, smiling slightly. You gave us a chance, Michael. A chance I had been waiting for a long time. And I just did what I knew how to do. I cooked. Taking care of the restaurant was like taking care of myself. Of Lily. She looked around the room where Lily played happily, unaware of the hardships they had faced. It was the only way I could thank you for this opportunity. Michael felt his throat tighten. He had never thought that his gesture, the act of leaving Grace and Lily in the restaurant, could have such an impact. To him, it had been a final breath of kindness amidst his own disillusionment. Now, listening to Grace, he understood that this simple act, however small, had given her and her daughter a new beginning, and in a way was giving him a new perspective as well. I never knew, Michael murmured, unsure of what else to say. The weight of Grace's story was overwhelming, but also inspiring. She had faced more than he could ever have imagined, and yet, there she was, not only surviving but bringing back to life something he had given up fighting for. Michael stepped out of the kitchen and returned to the dining room, his heart and mind completely consumed by a whirlwind of thoughts. He leaned against one of the empty tables, watching the quiet movement around him. The customers smiled, talked, and savored the meals Grace had prepared. The atmosphere was warm, familiar, something he had always wanted for the restaurant but had never truly achieved. The shock of seeing the place so vibrant, after having convinced himself it was a complete failure, was profound. He had never imagined that in his absence, life would flourish there again. Am I ready to give up, or to start again? The question echoed in Michael's mind repeatedly. He had put the restaurant up for sale, already resigned to failure, believing there was nothing more that could be done. It was a practical decision, the only one that seemed logical at the time. But now, looking at the full tables, at Lily's laughter, at the smell of food that enveloped the room with a sense of warmth, the idea of selling seemed unbearable. He realized that what he was about to lose wasn't just a business. It was something much bigger. Michael walked over to the window and looked outside. The streets were quiet, but the activity in the restaurant continued. A couple walked through the door, smiling as they inhaled the aroma in the air. Another group of satisfied customers. He remembered the emptiness that had dominated the place just a week before, the pain of closing the doors and the feeling that everything was lost. Now it was as if fate was offering him a second chance. But was he ready to embrace it? Grace and Lily's lives had become intertwined with his in a way he had never predicted. The simple gesture of offering them shelter had created a new cycle, something that Michael couldn't ignore. Grace's resilience, her ability to transform the space, had brought about a renewal that he could never have achieved alone. He now saw that the restaurant wasn't just his, it was a place of stories, of new beginnings. A place that, in the right hands, could flourish in ways he had never imagined. As he pondered, Michael felt a mixture of gratitude and fear. The path to starting over was uncertain, full of challenges, and he had already faced so many difficulties before. Failure was a possibility, falling into the same cycle of frustrations again. But at the same time, he knew that if he gave up now, he would lose something much more than money or work. He would lose a new family, a new purpose. The idea of selling and leaving all this behind now seemed more and more absurd. He turned his gaze back to Lily, who was still playing with a carefree smile. The little girl, unknowingly, had brought light to that place, just like her mother. Michael knew that Grace hadn't just rescued the restaurant, she had also rescued something inside him. The flame of hope, which he thought was extinguished, now shone again. The question was, would he have the courage to follow this new path even without guarantees? Michael sat down in one of the chairs and rubbed his face with his hands. Start over. He murmured the word as if he were tasting it for the first time. The concept of starting over had always seemed painful, an acknowledgement of failure. But now, in this context, the word took on a different meaning. It wasn't just about him. It was about Grace, Lily, and what they had created together, even without realizing it. The dilemma continued to echo in his mind. Sell or fight for a new beginning? But as Michael reflected, the answer became clearer. He didn't want to leave behind what was growing there. The restaurant, once just a dream, was now a symbol of something greater, something deeper. And suddenly he realized that the decision wasn't about business. It was about living again. About trusting the people around him and letting the unexpected guide him. He looked around once more, feeling the weight of the decision he would soon have to make. The restaurant's atmosphere now felt like an embrace, a sense of belonging, of renewal. And for the first time in a long while, Michael smiled, knowing that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to start again. Michael watched Grace as she coordinated the small team in the kitchen. There was something almost magical in the way she moved her hands, as if everything she touched came to life. The restaurant, which once seemed destined for oblivion, now breathed with a vitality he had never known how to achieve. Each dish served, each satisfied customer, seemed like part of a symphony that only she knew how to conduct. Michael knew that there was something special happening here, something he couldn't ignore. He approached slowly, hesitating for a moment before entering the kitchen again. Grace, with her back turned, stirred a pot with precision, the aroma of the food filling the air in an almost hypnotic way. When she turned and saw him standing there with a contemplative expression on his face, she paused for a moment, curious. "Is everything okay?" she asked with a gentle smile, but also intrigued by Michael's silence. Michael took a deep breath. He knew what he wanted to say, but the words seemed heavy, laden with an importance he wasn't sure he was ready to express. "You've brought life back to this place, Grace," he began, his voice low but firm. "Something I thought was dead. And now I don't see any other option but to start again. Together." His words hung in the air between them, filled with sincerity and a proposal he never thought he'd make. Grace blinked, surprised, the silence stretching for a moment. She hadn't expected that. From the beginning, she had only thought about keeping the restaurant alive while Michael decided what to do. But now, the proposal he was making changed everything. "Start again, together?" she repeated as if testing the idea in her mind. Her eyes searched Michael's, trying to understand if he was really willing to bet not just on the restaurant, but on her as well. "Yes," he replied more confidently this time. "I thought this place was finished. I thought there was no future for me here. But you've shown me something different. It's not just about the restaurant, it's about what we can do together. Simple but real. Focused on real food in an environment where people feel at home. You've brought that to this place, Grace. I can't imagine this place without you." The silence in the kitchen was broken only by the soft sound of steam escaping from the pot. Grace lowered her gaze for a moment, absorbing everything Michael was saying. She had always known that the restaurant had potential, but she never imagined that he would see in her actions such a deep possibility. The idea of starting over, after so long believing that the world only offered her barriers, now seemed real, tangible. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice filled with restrained emotion. "You don't have to say anything now," Michael responded softly. "I just want you to know that I don't want to move forward without you. I know it's not easy. I know you have a life full of challenges, but together we can create something here. Something of our own. A place where your passion for cooking and my love for this space meet. We can make it work, Grace. I have no doubt." Grace looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears, and took a deep breath. There were so many things she never believed she could achieve again, but here was Michael, offering not just a job, but a true partnership, a new chance to dream. "I've always dreamed of this, you know," she said with a soft smile. "Having a restaurant, a place where I could do what I love, and where people could find more than just food, where they could find comfort. I don't know how it happened, but if you're willing to try, so am I." Michael smiled, relieved and emotional. The decision had been made. Together they would start over, bringing something new to the world from the ruins of the old. It was a leap into the unknown, but deep down he knew it was worth it. "Then it's settled," he said, his voice filled with hope. "We'll start again, together." The new restaurant, now carrying not only Michael's name but also Grace's soul, opened its doors with an enchanting simplicity. The renovation was modest, but the atmosphere was infused with human warmth. The walls, once cold and lifeless, were painted in a soft, welcoming color, and on the tables, small vases with fresh flowers brought a touch of beauty and renewal. It wasn't just a place to eat, it was a space where people felt at home, where every detail was carefully thought out to convey a feeling of belonging. Lily ran from table to table, always with a smile on her face, charming the customers with her spontaneous joy. She was now part of the restaurant's routine, delivering menus or simply playing in the corners, while the atmosphere flowed with a new energy. Grace, in the kitchen, commanded the stoves with the same dedication as before, but now with an even greater purpose. Every dish that came from her hands seemed to tell a story, as if she were giving something back to the world. Something lost but never forgotten. Michael moved between the tables, talking to the customers, sharing stories, and watching with silent pride the transformation they had created together. He had never imagined that the restaurant would become something so different, so alive. The local community, which once hurried past the door, now entered and stayed, enjoying not only the food but the warmth that the place emanated. It was more than just a restaurant, it was a meeting place, a space where people connected. The menu reflected the new philosophy of simplicity and authenticity. Home-cooked meals, prepared with fresh ingredients and seasoned with love, were served with care. There was no ostentation, only the real taste of well-made food. People returned not just for the flavor but for the feeling of being cared for. Sometimes starting over isn't a choice but the only option, and the most beautiful one, Grace often said, and those words stayed engraved in Michael's heart. One night after a busy day, Grace and Michael sat at one of the restaurant's tables, while Lily slept peacefully in a corner. Fatigue was evident on their faces, but there was something else, a sense of accomplishment that transcended the hard work. "Did you ever imagine we'd get here?" Michael asked, looking around, still surprised at how much they had built in such a short time. Grace smiled, her eyes tired but glowing with pride. "I never thought it would be easy, but I never lost hope either. Somehow, I always knew that something good could come out of all this." She looked at Michael with gratitude. "You gave me this chance and now look where we are." "It wasn't just me," Michael replied, shaking his head. "We did this together. I just brought the space. You brought the heart." There was a sincerity in his words that made Grace take a deep breath. They both knew that the restaurant's success went beyond the dishes served. It was about what they had built together, a new life, a new purpose. As the months passed, the restaurant continued to thrive, attracting more and more people from the city and the surrounding areas. But what impressed Michael the most wasn't the financial growth. It was seeing how the community had embraced the place. People came to celebrate birthdays, family gatherings, and important moments in their lives. The restaurant, which he had once thought was doomed, had become a symbol of resilience and renewal. As Michael turned off the lights that night, he looked at Grace and Lily, who were getting ready to leave, and for a moment he realized that he had gained something much greater than just a restaurant back. He had found a new family, a new beginning, and, most importantly, a new reason to believe in the future. If you enjoyed the incredible story of Michael, Grace, and Lily, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love heartwarming stories and want to support our channel in continuing to bring more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next emotional story.